All right, hello everyone. My name is Jack,
I'm Tasha.
I'm Will.
I'm Cameron.
And I'm Noah.
and this will be our pitch for Big Brothers Big Sisters Twin Cities on how we can better understand match length, closure reason, and what makes a good match. Now, first of all, we're going to find what it means to be a successful match. This is a match that remains active, a match that lasts a long time, which we decided was 1 year, a match that closes due to the age of the little, and the closure reason being successful match closure.
All right, first we were asked to look at some variable distributions. The first one we looked at were match length distributions. We found that the average was just under 2 years, which was 23 months. And we can see that most of the matches are clustering on the lower end of the scale, so that a lot more matches are lasting under 2 years compared to matches that are lasting 3 or 4 years. And we also looked at the closure reason distributions, and we found that the reason that the matches are closing is because of the bigs, which is 2 times more likely to happen than the next biggest reason, which is the child family. An example of the bigs closing the matches would be if the bigs are moving away or if they don't feel they have enough time to connect with their little. An example of the child family being the closure reason would be if the child family moves away or if they lose connection with the big. And so just the insights, the average match length we found was just under 2 years. And we also wanted to further look into why so many of the matches were closing because of the bigs. And so to do this, there's a column named closure reason, and we did some text analysis on it. And these were the top 5 phrases that we managed to pull out of that column. So these are being unable to reach their little, needing more support from BBBS, being too busy to schedule with their little, mental health issues, and moving away, whether that be from the big or from the little.
And next we looked at these same variable distributions but across the different program types offered by Big Brothers Big Sisters. The first one we look at again is match length, and as we can see, the community program type had an overall much longer match length than the site-based ones. It was overall longer by around 11 months on average. And then again, we looked at the closure reason across program types, and the community-based programs, the bigs again was the largest closure reason, but it flips to the child being the most common closure type in the site-based programs.
Next, we looked at variable distributions by demographics. First, looking at gender distribution, where we compared matches of the same gender versus matches of different genders. We looked at both match length and closure reason, where we saw no clear difference for both when comparing same versus different gender matches. Then we did the same thing with the race, where we were looking at same versus different race matches, and again saw no clear difference with match length and closure reason. Finally, we looked at big age distribution, where we found big age to be highly valuable in both our cluster analysis and prediction, which we will get into later. And we found big age to be positively correlated with match length. We then fit a simple linear regression, which showed a positive slope correlation, meaning the older a big is, the longer a match is.
All right, so next we're going to get into match length by cadence. And when we're talking about cadence here, we're referring to the number of days between phone calls. And phone calls in this case is between the big and the agency. Now, if we look on the left here, we will see the distribution of match length for those with a below average cadence, so more days in between calls. So you can see it's only 15 months compared to those with an above average cadence of an average match length of 38 months. Now, there are many different reasons why this could be, but one of the reasons we thought of was a very common reason why bigs are closing matches is because they don't have enough time, they need more support, or they have mental health issues. And all these things could get in the way of them living their lives and having time to spend with their little.
All right, along with looking at those calls between the bigs and BBBS, they kept track of what was said during those calls, and so we decided to look at the sentiment of the words being said during those calls. We decided to look how it changed over time, so how it would change from the very first call compared to the very last call. And to do this, we looked at the average sentiment of the last half of their calls and then subtracted the average sentiment of the first half of their calls. What we found is that the shorter matches have less of a sentiment change compared to the longer matches, which have a larger sentiment change. This doesn't mean that the longer matches are necessarily have a more positive or negative sentiment. It just means that they had a greater change from the start to the end. So for example, the shorter matches sentiment might only change by 5%, where the longer matches sentiment might change by 20%.
Next, we're going to look at factors that determine successful and unsuccessful matches. Now to do this, we took a clustering approach where we had 4 clusters and each match was placed into a cluster based on a number of variables. Now, for this analysis, we only want to focus on cluster 1, which had our highest average match length, and cluster 3, which had our lowest average match length. There were 4 variables that really affected where each match was placed in each cluster. Big age, the cadence or days between calls, closure reason, and the match type. Now we see for our numerical variables, big age and cadence or days between calls, cluster 1 has a higher cadence, so the higher the cadence, the more likely they are to be placed in cluster 1. And cluster 3 has a lower cadence and has a pretty young big on average. Next, we're going to look at our cluster 1 and cluster 3. Determine the distribution of the match types between these clusters. So again, cluster 1 had our highest average match length and cluster 3 had our lowest average match length. And we can see that cluster 1 has a majority of their matches as community-based matches, whereas cluster 3, while still having quite a bit of community-based matches, also has a good amount of site-based matches. So from this, we can infer that community-based matches tend to have higher average match lengths. Next up, we're going to look at cluster 1 and cluster 3 when comparing closure reasons. Now, the big takeaway from this visual is that cluster 3, which are less successful cluster with an average match length of about 12 months, had a large variety of closures coming from the big and the agency, whereas the opposite is observed with cluster 1. Those matches were very rarely closed by the big or the agency.
All right, so next we're going to get into our predictive component here. Now for this predictive component, we wanted to make a model that could predict the match length. Now we decided to do a random forest for this method because it can handle high dimensionality of data and is really flexible. We performed our own custom truncation scheme, meaning we randomly removed some of the final phone calls from the matches. We did this as our way of almost going back in time and being able to predict matches before they're closed, so before they've had their last phone call and things like that. Some variables that proved to be very valuable for this prediction modeling was some summary statistics on our sentiment analysis, the age of the big starting year and program type. We did 10-fold cross-validation to validate our model, an R-squared of 98% and an RMSE of 3.2 months. Here's our actual versus predicted plot, and the closer the points are to the y equals x line, the more agreement we have. We have some overall really good agreement, so we are satisfied with this model.
And then we just have a couple closing thoughts we want to leave you guys with today. As we said before, that the most common closure reason was from the bigs ending the match. So again, these are the most common phrases that we picked out of the phone calls with Big Brothers Big Sisters, and we were asked to come up with a question set that Big Brothers Big Sisters could ask the bigs in order to better gauge whether the match will close soon. So we wanted to focus our questions on addressing the big closure reason. And so the questions that we came up with is, have you been having any issues contacting your little? Do you feel adequately trained and supported by Big Brothers Big Sisters? Do you feel you have enough time to connect with your little? Have you been using any strategies to manage your time? And do you and your little plan to stay in the area for the foreseeable future?
In addition to that question set, we just wanted to give some action steps that the company could follow. We found that community-based matches on average last about 11 months longer, so encouraging those community-based matches could lead to longer matches. We also found that the big age was positively correlated with match length, and so just trying to reach out to older demographic and structuring recruiting events around targeting the older demographic could be beneficial. And we also found that the main reason that matches are closing is because the bigs are having communication issues and losing communication with their littles. So we would recommend making sure that the parents of the littles are really staying involved, because that's who the bigs are usually going to be in contact with, making sure they have constant and strong communication channels, and just keeping that communication continuing. And if there's any questions, and here's our contact information.